Oxford from the inside. The good, the bad, but always the truth.
Hello, and welcome to Oxford from the Inside. The good, the bad, but always the truth. I'm your host, Ellis, and today I'm joined by the lovely Kirsten. Hello, Kirsten.
Hi, Ellis.
Would you like to introduce yourself to the listeners?
Yeah, of course. So my name's Kirsten, and I'm a fourth year student of German at Trinity College.
So today we're going to be talking about personal statements. As a finalist, it would have been a long time since you wrote a personal statement.
Yeah.
How do you feel about it looking back?
Mm-hmm. So I think at the time that I was writing it, I think I definitely stressed out a lot more about it than I probably needed to. I remember also trying to make it sound really fancy and, like I was an expert on my like an expert on my subject at the time, which, you're 16 or 17 when you're writing it. You're definitely not an expert. The tutor who's reading it might be. So really, it's important to be honest, but it's much more just about showing what you've learned and the extra things you've thought about whatever you've done, and sort of how you can link that to your subject. You don't need to make yourself sound like the most impressive person on earth, realistically. So yeah, obviously it's a good chance to make a good first impression on the tutors and admissions teams. I think especially for humanities subjects and something like languages as well, where you need to be able to sort of write to a decent standard. But yeah. I think especially for Oxford as well, because it's only one part of the admissions process, it's not the be all end all.
I think that's important to highlight, first of all, that the tutors don't expect you to be like completely clued up on everything. Like, it is just an introduction to like kind of who you are, what you want to do. Like while you're applying, it's literally a personal statement. And as well, like you said, it's such a small part of the actual applications process, because obviously for modern languages you have to do the MLAT, you submit work, you submit your personal statement that's got like your grades on it as well, all things like that like sort of form a big picture of who you are. But this is your kind of like opportunity to like showcase your kind of interests and like why you want to do what you're doing. So how difficult did you find it at the time?
So like I said, I definitely in my first draft tried to make myself sound way fancier than I actually was. I remember my first tutor, when he gave me feedback on my first draft, he was saying you use such like over the top ridiculous phrases like, oh, I've loved this ever since I was 5 or whatever, like these really cliched statements. I think that there's probably everything has probably been said in one personal statement or another at some time. I think it's probably hard to do something like completely individual or like really out there, but I think staying away from the really overdone phrases, like passionate, I think it's quite good to sort of stay away from things like that. My main difficulty as well was that I was only applying for German Sol at Oxford. My other 4 courses were all German and economics combined. So it meant that half of my statement was about economics. I really had to make everything that I was saying in my German section sort of really to the point. I really had to get value out of every word. Because my concern as well was that, if this is going to my Oxford interviewer who sees half of the statement isn't even about his subject or their subject, will they think, oh, this girl isn't committed, she doesn't actually know what she wants to do, is she just confused about what she's applying to? But I think that probably does show that it is much more quality than quantity, because obviously I still got an interview, I still got in with essentially half of an irrelevant statement, so it's really about making that paragraph count.
If you had to do the personal statement with only half of it for German Sol, what kind of pushed you towards applying for Oxford, for like the course at Oxford, knowing that you had to apply for you were applying for something different at other universities?
So I know that I would have regretted it if I didn't try to apply for either Oxford or Cambridge. So I chose Oxford over Cambridge because, as far as I know, I think this is still the same, but you can't do just one language at Cambridge, or at least you couldn't in 2017 when I was applying. So that meant that, you know, there was no way that I could try and fit another language in there. Otherwise, this personal statement would have had economics, German, and something else, and it would have just been so convoluted. And then Oxford's combined honours for languages. There are a couple of options. So you can combine languages with linguistics, English, history, philosophy, classics and English. I think they're the options. But, you know, things like maths or economics that aren't sort of more closely aligned, you don't really have the option to do that at somewhere like Oxford. So yeah, I applied for German Soul at Oxford, and then didn't really expect to get in or be offered an interview or anything. But then sort of the deeper I got into the process, obviously it kept going. And then when I was made an offer, it was basically just, you know, did I enjoy the interview? Is this a place that I can see myself in the future? I think that is something quite good about the interviews as well. Since you're spending normally at least 2 days there, maybe 3 or 4, depending if you're waiting for interviews sort of to be announced if you need any more. That's a really good opportunity to actually work out if you like it as a place, and whether you would enjoy the style of teaching, because, you know, you could be on track for 4 A stars, but realistically, if you don't like that small group teaching, don't go. You won't enjoy it. There's no point. But
no, I understand. I also, like, with terms of knowing exactly what you have to fit in and where, I think it is important to have sort of like your eyes on the prize in a way of, this is a subject that you want to study, this is why I'm a good candidate to do it. Because I was in a sort of similar-ish position when I applied, because I was applying for French and beginner's German. So I had to sort of have a bit in there to be like, oh, well, I'm good at learning vocabulary. I really want to pick up another language to improve work prospects. Like, I like the commercialness, like the commercial prospects of learning German. I'm motivated enough from learning French, which is why I think I'd be good at learning German, and to sort of like weave that in to the personal statement, so it doesn't. So it all kind of like flows into one thing.
Yeah. So I think something quite good that I did with mine was, obviously I don't study economics now, but in my personal statement in my introduction, I did sort of weave the two of them together. I think I made some point about globalization and how, you know, you sort of need the language skills to be able to, you know, do cross-border transactions or whatever. So yeah, I think if you are applying for more than one subject, then it is definitely useful to be able to connect them in your statement.
So we're talking about the introductions. Do you think it's important to have a really punchy opening line?
So, I mean, I think it's unrealistic to think that, you know, it's not as though everyone's like a really good author that's writing a personal statement. I think it's probably just better to think about avoiding cliches rather than worrying about trying to like have this killer first sentence or like this punchy first sentence. Because I mean, realistically, you know, in theory, they will be reading the full thing. It's not as though they'll only read your first sentence and then think, oh, I'm not going to bother with the rest. So I mean, I think if you have a good first sentence, then obviously great, but don't sort of get too hung up on it, really. I think as long as it all sort of flows and the general structure stronger, I think that's more important, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely a trap that I fell into, of being like, oh, I need to say something really profound that's going to grab their attention. I think I ended up with like, oh, the study of modern languages is essential to modern day society, which first of all, it's just taking up word space. It doesn't mean anything. And second, kind of, well, obviously, because otherwise we wouldn't have so many different languages. So I think with hindsight, that's something that I would definitely not include. I think I would start somewhere with like, I want to study French because.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is fine, you know, not to sort of try and overcomplicate your sentences. And you know, it's like when you used to do like creative writing and things for English GCSE, and like you try and have the most amazing similes or metaphors and be like, oh, I need a semicolon. Writing a personal statement isn't like that. You know, there's not a tick box of sort of writing features that you need to include. So yeah, like I said, I think it's much more just about the general structure and the general flow that's more important.
Yeah, and again, it's just so important to reiterate that there's no perfect way to write a personal statement. Like everyone's different, and also it's not one of those things like when you do an English GCSE that's like, oh well, you start a paragraph with point, evidence, explanation, and link. It's not like that. Like the point is just to get yourself across and get your experience across, really.
Yeah.
What's your favorite thing that you put in your personal statement?
Ooh, my favorite thing.
Like your proudest kind of like achievement, or just something that you think would have impressed the people who read it.
So I'm trying to think what I wrote. So I know that I remember in my economics point, I sort of said something quite personal, and I think this just relates more to the general idea of being authentic in your personal statement rather than trying to talk about more like generic things. So I think, for example, with my economics, I talked something about HS2 and like the local impact that I saw on local communities. So I think, again, you know, for whatever subject you're applying for, if you do have some kind of personal, not anecdote, that's the wrong word, but you know, if you do have some kind of personal story that you can talk about, then obviously go for it. In terms of my German side of things, so I talked about a little bit about 2 books, 1 film, and then also an exchange that I did. And the exchange involved some extra intensive vocab sessions. So it was more than just a sort of cultural exchange. There was sort of a real clear focus on language learning as well. So I talked about how valuable I'd found it that, you know, we'd had sessions dedicated to sort of idioms in terms of phrases and speech. So I basically said it was really useful. And also when we were in classrooms with the German students as well, I talked about how it was a really good opportunity to see the nuances in language and like the contractions in day-to-day speech. So yeah, it is definitely important to be specific rather than vague in your statement. But also just don't go reeling off like a list of books or films just for the sake that you really need to have some substance to what you're saying as well.
Definitely. I think mine was probably about doing like a month-long volunteering placement in France. I think that was my like eye-grabbing thing, which I know obviously like not everyone will be in like the same position that they can do that, and I don't think it's like an important thing, but I think it kind of showed like how willing I was to go and learn the language and put myself out of my comfort zone, which obviously with modern languages degrees, it's so essential to kind of show that you'll make an effort to like really kind of like assimilate, to just absorb as much language as possible, because you know Oxford modern languages degrees aren't easy, and already having like a good basis of knowledge is so essential. That's not to say that you don't get support when you start, because you do, and if your grammar's kind of not where it should be, you'll get helped out. But obviously on the personal statement you need to be like, I'm so committed, I'm so dedicated to doing this course.
I think that's something sort of weird about writing a personal statement as well, no matter what subject it's for, because I'd never really had to do that before, where I had to sort of big myself up, almost like marketing yourself, and then obviously after uni, when you sort of do other applications, that is something that you just sort of have to do. You sort of have to get on with it. So I think writing the personal statement when you first attempt it, it does feel very unnatural. It can feel quite stilted. Like, oh, I don't want to brag, I don't want to boast. But at the end of the day, if you can stand out for whatever reason, then talk about what makes you stand out as a candidate.
Yeah, definitely. I think another thing that's worth including in personal statements is like stuff that makes you sort of like always qualified to go to uni. So if you've been to like open days and taster sessions and sort of like summer schools, things like that, like are so important, because you can highlight,
sure.
you know, oh well, I've been in a lecture about something and I really enjoyed it, which seems so kind of banal when you mention it, but like I think these are the kind of things that set you apart from other people.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing, you know, you don't have to talk about the most incredible experiences. It can just be, you know, I listened to this podcast, I listened to this one interview with someone, or I mean, you can even talk about something that you've read or watched in class, and then just say, oh yeah, I found this really interesting because XYZ. You know, you don't have to have, I don't know, been backpacking in the depths of France or whatever for a year. You know, so.
Yeah, I think probably the most important thing that you can put across on your personal statement is just being authentic. So
yeah, for sure.
So anything that's kind of made you want to study modern languages is entirely valid to put on the personal statement, because you know it's you, and that's what sort of makes you your own candidate, as opposed to sort of putting like vague things, like you said, that kind of anyone can put on.
Yeah.
Did you do things specifically to put on your personal statement, or did you kind of just gather like a mass of experiences kind of over the years? Like, were you thinking about personal statement fodder way before it came to writing it?
I guess it might have, realistically, it's probably sort of in the back of my mind, but I don't think I ever really did anything experience-wise with the intention of being like, oh, I can talk about this in my personal statement. So yeah, the exchange that I did between year 12 and year 13, you know, I did that only a few months before writing my personal statement. That was just coincidental timing, but I could then talk about that in my statement. But it wasn't as though I sort of had that consciously in mind. Something that I did do was I did think about which books or which films I could write about. So the film that I mentioned was Goodbye Lenin, which I think I'd taken out of the college library, or I think I'd watched it with my German teacher as like an end of term treat. So obviously I didn't watch that thinking, oh, you know, I'll write about this on my statement later, but it did give me something to talk about, because I sort of talked about the difference in West and East Germany and Berlin, and then, you know, what's left of that culture today, how has that culture developed. So I think it is fine to, you know, read things or watch things with the intention of putting them on your statement, so you have things to talk about. But I mean, you hear this said, I think, in almost every single personal statement interview or workshop or whatever. Don't put something on there that you wouldn't be confident to talk about in an interview, or, you know, that you can have a conversation with. So there was a book that I mentioned, and it sort of talked about the development of the German language, and how certain features have sort of died out a little bit and what they've been replaced with. I think I basically really just skim read this book and found one particular point that I found quite interesting, and then mentioned that in my statement as though I'd read the full thing. And you know, obviously zapped my statement off, and then it came time to have my interview. I just remember in the couple of days before my interview, I was just so paranoid where you think you could be caught out. You do really need to be prepared to speak about whatever you've mentioned, even if it might not come up.
Yeah, I completely agree. It is important. And I think,
did you mention any specific things?
Yeah, so I remember specifically, I mentioned 2 books. I think I mentioned Les Mis, but I'd read it in translation. I can't remember if I specified that I'd read it in translation on. I think I did say that I'd read it in translation to kind of, get just to be able to read like a 1,000-page novel.
Yeah.
And absorb it. Whereas I mentioned reading like smaller texts in the language. And I also mentioned as well that I'd read one of my favorite books in English, but in translation into French, so I could kind of compare the two and sort of like understand how things might be translated. But again, like there was Les Mis, which I knew quite well, and then another book which I had like skim read, but I kind of put in because I was like, oh well, it looks good anyway. And then in the interview, I was actually given the choice between which book I wanted to talk about, and I was like, oh
really?
Yeah, which was lucky in a way, because otherwise I would have maybe been a bit stuck. So I think it is just so important to be authentic, and it might not sound that with us saying that we'd put things in that we didn't mean, but don't do that, because it won't get you anywhere good if you get caught out on it. So in terms of structuring a personal statement for modern languages, which obviously yours will have only been half modern languages, how did you kind of go about structuring it?
So I think in my German section, I think I started off by saying why where my initial interest in German had come from, which for me was that my dad's sort of a huge metal and rock fan, so I'd grown up with German music playing in the car from German metal bands. And it sounds like a stupid little funny anecdote, but I think hearing those sounds when I was younger did almost like plant the seeds for an interest later on. And then, I mean, it was only really in year 11 when the grammar really clicked, and I started to think, oh, maybe I could do this at college. And then, in college I still enjoyed it, so then decided to do it for degree. So I think I mentioned my initial interest, and then spoke about the books and the film, and about sort of the general cultural questions that they raised. And then I rounded it off by talking about the exchange that I'd done. It did sort of have a bit of the literature side of things, the critical thinking, but then also, I can string a sentence together in German.
I think mine was kind of similar, where I had sort of like an introductory paragraph about why I kind of wanted to do French, and then I spoke about kind of how my studies had prepared it for me, and sort of like extracurricular study related things, so like summer schools and exchanges, I think. And I kind of spoke about those in detail, then had the kind of like reading that I'd done and films that I'd watched, and then just kind of spoke about, like, I kind of mentioned the future despite not really knowing what I wanted to do, by just being I think studying French will be a good basis for looking for a job in the future, for like going into translation or stuff like that, which I think really it's not too difficult to structure a personal statement when you kind of know what to put in it. It kind of ends up writing itself when you've got like experience, and like even things like anecdotes, I think, go in quite well.
So I know that I think in one of my first few drafts I talked a bit about the future as well, but then I don't think I had room, or I had to prioritize something else over talking about the future. So I didn't include that in mine, but I know people that did. Another thing that I think I mentioned quite briefly in mine was how my other A-level subjects, like you said, how they sort of complemented what I was wanting to do at university, the skills that I learned from those. So I'd done maths at AS level, which, obviously useful for economics, but then also, it's formulaic, it has patterns. I think I might have made some quite convoluted point about, spotting patterns and having like set structures. I think that has actually been quite useful for me in terms of spotting patterns in languages. And I mean, I hadn't studied linguistics at college or school. I've only really done one linguistics based module even at university, but you know, it is that slightly more logical, structured thinking. Yeah, so I think I made some point in my personal statement about I really enjoyed playing with like the building blocks of language, and how with German, you know, the verb gets sent to the end half the time, and just little things like that. So yeah.
Yeah. Did you like have support when you were writing your personal statement? Like, were there people you could kind of go to in your sixth form for advice, or did you kind of like look online? Like, how did you sort of go about actual like inspiration for it?
So I had sort of a normal form tutor at sixth form, who had a group of 25 or 30 students, and he was responsible for our personal statements. I was actually quite lucky at my sixth form because the head teacher had done history at Cambridge, so he understood that, you know, for an Oxbridge personal statement, it has to be more academic focused. You know, it's fine to put in a sentence about your extracurriculars, but that shouldn't be a huge portion of your statement. So I was very lucky that he looked over, I think, the first draft, maybe another one, but he did look them over before we sent them off. I think outside of college, I also made the mistake of looking on the student room at what people were saying about theirs or what they'd written before. And the student room has its uses, but you also get the most sort of showy offy, you know, insane students who are not the norm at all. So I would probably take whatever's written on the student room with a pinch of salt, I think.
Yeah, I think there are always sort of like examples that you can find online that just don't match up to like real life, especially like if you've gone to a state school, which like I did, I think you did as well. Like it's often that you'll kind of get to the point of writing your university applications where you just kind of don't know where to start, and like I think it's important to remember that you are just valid in like not really knowing how to write a personal statement, like, and as well, like everything that we've kind of said here should just be taken as advice rather than being like, oh well, you must include this and you must include this, because you know, we're not on the admissions board, like we don't actually know what they're looking out for. But obviously, like, I think it's important to just kind of be like well-rounded, I suppose.
Yeah, I would agree.
So has your opinion of your degree changed since writing your personal statement? Like, when you were writing the personal statement, what kind of did you expect the degree to be like versus how it's ended up turning out?
So obviously before writing my personal statement, I'd been to a few different university open days, and I think I sort of made the mistake of thinking that a language course would be the same course at every university. So I remember going to an open day at Newcastle that I really enjoyed, and it sounded like there was room for sort of specific like translation and interpretation modules. Obviously we do translation here at Oxford as well, but there's no kind of interpretation module, for example. So yeah, I mean, I definitely looked through some of the handbooks online for Oxford, which I would definitely recommend for any student for any subject as well, because that breaks down your module choices so you can get a really clear view of, you know, what you might be able to study. I read through this, but still didn't really grasp how literature based the course would be. So to say that I am effectively, you know, a 60-70% literature student, I should probably enjoy reading a lot more than I do. So yeah, I would say that my view of the degree has changed, but obviously there is still a focus on language as well. But you know, at the end of the day, Oxford isn't for everyone just because of the style of teaching or the content on the course. So if you are interested in Oxford, then amazing, but don't necessarily put all your eggs in one basket, because it might just be that the course isn't right for you, really.
Yeah. No, I think it's fine for your opinion to change though over it, because I think there's kind of no way of preparing yourself for like the workload and just like what you're going to face at university, because it's just a completely different way of like thinking and working than what you get like at sixth form. But I think that's both a plus and a negative. Obviously the teaching is just amazing, and it's like it's so exciting to have like a one-on-one with someone who's an expert, but then you know, you don't have that much leeway on what you get to study, you know, in terms of like there not being an interpreting paper or things like that. But yeah, after like 4 years, what's been like your favorite thing about your degree?
So it's awkward because I always think about the favorite things in Oxford in general, rather than just focus to my degree. I would say that the tutors can offer you a lot of support, because, you know, the teaching is more personalised and more intimate in terms of it being smaller subject groups. So that has been really useful at times, and I have really enjoyed getting to know some of the tutors. But I think I could have maybe made use of that a little bit more, and maybe sort of reached out to them more sometimes to say, oh, you know, I'm not really happy with how this has gone, I'm struggling with this. So I think the Oxford system, you can get a lot out of it, but sometimes you have to almost be a bit brave to do that, and don't be afraid of reaching out to your tutors and talking to them. But yeah, so I think just the way that the tutorials work, really, and the opportunity that it can provide, I think that's something that only really Oxford and Cambridge can do. What about you? What would you say your favourite thing's been?
I think mine's similar, of like the tutorials, but also just like having the opportunity to like go abroad, despite obviously lockdown and everything. But I think sort of, you know, being able to just actually practice the language has been good, because also in our normal uni term time, we don't get as much oral practice as like we perhaps should.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the Oxford experience in itself, when it works for you, is just like amazing, because I think you adapt quickly, and I think you get smarter and make progress quickly, which is always really nice. So I think we've got time for one more question. So what would your advice be to someone who is about to undertake writing a personal statement for modern languages?
Okay, so I think you can boil it down to 2 points, really. Try and avoid cliches, but also just be honest. You know, it's really not the world's most earth-shattering advice. It's probably been said 1,000 times before, but I think really if you stick to those 2 things, you'll come out with a decent personal statement, chances are.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you to everyone who's listened. You can find us on social media. You can find us on YouTube at Oxford from the Inside, and also we're on Spotify and also Instagram at Oxford from the Inside. Until next time. Bye.
Bye.